colorful quilters, and welcome to Color Girl Quilts on YouTube. I am thrilled today to be here as part of a collaboration with some other YouTube creators in sharing our favorite tips and tricks around sewing and quilting. There are a lot of different topics on the list, and you will find links to all of my friends' videos as well in the description of this video. So don't go away yet. Stay and watch here for a few minutes, and then go ahead and check out everybody else's videos. I am sure you will have a lot to learn today. So happy National Quilting Day. And for my topic, I am bringing you a tutorial that many of you have asked for over the years, and I'm finally getting around to doing it. So if you haven't been here before, I'm Sharon, and my primary sewing and quilting love is curves and circles. And I created and designed the Classic Curves Ruler. You'll find other videos demonstrating that, and curved piecing, and everything to do with circles and curves and everything that you might want to do on the playlists on my channel. So I hope that you will subscribe and check those out. Today's video is for those who have been making curved piecing quilts with me, and you have scraps. When you cut the two concave curve shapes, the corners for your curved blocks, typically we cut two at a time, and so we end up with this scrap of fabric that comes out of the middle between the two shapes like this. So if we have another, if you can imagine, we cut this one and we cut this one, and we have this shape in the middle. And people have asked, what should I do with these scraps? Because some of them, depending on the quilt you're making, can be pretty good size. So I've explained to a few of you individually how to cut them down and repiece them into further blocks. But for today's tutorial, we are going to talk about fusible applique and how to turn your scraps into a really easy quilt. Okay, so the things that you'll need: your scrap orange peel shapes. You will need some fusible web. I just bought this Easy Steam Pellon from a local craft shop. It's pretty readily available and not very expensive. I also recommend having some freezer paper on hand to use as stabilizer if you plan to eventually sew your pieces down with your sewing machine. I kind of like to use the Fusible to position the pieces where I want them. I press them so that they're fixed on with the iron, but then I could use a decorative stitch or a hand stitch to sew around the shapes and give them a little bit more of a finished edge. So I'm going to demonstrate how to use freezer paper as a really easy, inexpensive stabilizer that makes all the difference when it comes to machine applique. So that's an option for this. You'll also need some paper scissors for cutting your web. And I also recommend, if you have one, I really like these silicone pressing mats for protecting your iron and ironing board from the fusible web so that you don't get the sticky stuff on the surface of your iron. And I will show you how to use those as well. They are really handy. And if you're going to do any use fusibles and that sort of thing, you'll definitely want to have one so that you don't get the goo on your iron. Okay, so I think that about covers it. Oh, in addition to your scraps, you'll also need some fabric to put them on for your background. So you could do one large piece and arrange like a collage and do something kind of freeform. Or I am going to demonstrate how to cut squares out of different colorful fabrics. Since my pods are all black and white, I thought it would be fun to fix them on a background of a variety of bright colors, and it will just make for a really fun, colorful quilt. This was stuff that I had in my stash, so it feels good to get that used. So I'm going to show you how to do that, but I'll also show you some other ideas on how you might want to play with this and experiment on your own. Okay, so our first step is to prepare our applique shapes with the fusible web. So we are going to go to the cutting mat and get started. Alrighty, so I'm going to start by kind of assessing my scraps and figuring out how big I need to cut my background squares if I'm going to put each of these orange peel shapes on its own background piece. I am just positioning it on a 45-degree angle so I can figure out a square, and I have the point of one end of the orange peel at the 1/2 inch mark on my ruler. I want to remember to make sure that I leave some fabric excess so that when I sew them together, I have seam allowance. So you could go as skinny as a 1/4 inch, or as wide as you want if you want them to be further apart. So I am going to go with a 1/2 inch. That gives me a little bit of flexibility if for some reason my squares get wonky when I press them, or I don't get the piece on perfectly straight. I will have some ability to trim my piece down to a 1/4 inch around my shape if I want to. So I've got it on the 1/2 inch. It's following the 45-degree angle on the ruler and hitting down here at the 7.5 inch mark. So I'll add another 1/2 inch, and this works out well that I can cut 8-inch squares to make my background fabric. Okay, and all of my orange peel shapes are the same, so I can do as many 8-inch squares as I want blocks for my quilt, or as many scraps as I have. Now, before I cut an 8-inch square, like I told you before, I plan to cut multiple squares out of multiple fabrics and sew them together kind of randomly to have just this colorful checkerboard background with the black and white orange peels on the front. But one of the choices that you have is to take that measurement that we just did and cut a square that is twice that size. So in our case, we might cut a 16-inch square. And if I did that, then I can take my orange peel scraps and put 4 of them on the same one. So if I cut a 16-inch square, I could then position my scraps kind of like a flower on one square. So I would get larger blocks. Instead of 8-inch blocks, I'd have 16-inch blocks, and all 4 pieces on one color. You could rearrange them into different patterns if you wanted to do each one on a square like this. As I was laying this out, it just occurred to me that it might be cool to cut squares like this and then sew them together on point, and then applique the scraps on the seam lines after you sew them together. And then you would get these shapes in the middle of the curves that would be different colors all the way around, and the seams would be hidden, and that would create a really interesting, cool effect as well. And you don't have to set them in circles. You could do, you could have them set side by side or in rows, or however you want to do them. So play around, and a lot of it depends on how much fabric you have to work with. If you have enough to just have one large piece that you arrange all of your shapes on and make like a whole cloth quilt, If you've got pieces big enough to cut large squares to put 4 pieces on, or if you want to just go kind of scrappy, which is what I'm doing, and you'll cut the minimum size square. So let's go ahead and for this pink one, it's a fat quarter that hasn't really been squared and straightened. So I'm going to cut an 8-inch square out of it and turn it around. Always remember to press your fabrics before you start cutting. You want to make sure that they're smooth and flat, don't have any wrinkles, and you can really see the edges and make sure that you've got straight sides. So that gives me an 8-inch square, and if we kind of lay that on there, this is going to be my future block. Okay? Next, we have our fusible web sheets. Now for the example that I'm using, it comes with a paper backing that has a grid printed on it, and then a plain white side. On the paper backing, you can use that if you are creating your own applique shapes and like draw things on here to cut out. But for our purposes, we don't need to do that because we're going to use the shapes that we already have. And so I just need to remove the white paper side, and that exposes this kind of tacky web. And what I can do is just position my piece on. Now they're not going to be permanent when you stick them on at this point. They'll still be able to be repositioned. So I want to put them on as carefully as I can so that I can maybe get as many possible on each sheet. And I think with my size, 2 is going to be the maximum. But if you're working with smaller shapes, you could potentially get quite a few out of each of your sheets of web. And as you can see, I'm just kind of finger pressing it smooth on there. And do that for both of them. I'll do 2 at a time since that's what will fit on my paper. Okay, and once you have them stuck on well to the fusible web, you can use paper scissors to cut them out, or I'm gonna see if I can just do it with my, since I've got nice smooth edges on my fabric, they're not, you know, anything intricate like letters or teddy bears or something like that. I'm just going to carefully cut around them, kind of eyeballing it with my rotary cutter. And look how fast that is, much faster than scissors. So let's do both of these. And obviously I am typically a proponent of piecing curves. That's kind of my wheelhouse, and that's what I encourage. I like it. But for using these scraps, it's kind of a fun change of pace to try the applique because of the freedom it gives you and how you can arrange your pieces differently than you can, you know, more easily do sort of like wonky modern or improv things that you can't do with piecing. So this is kind of a fun little change of pace. But so now that I have these cut, I'm going to cut another 8-inch square of another background fabric, and I will meet you at the ironing board. Okay, here we are ready to press. And in addition to the 8-inch squares I cut out of my fabric, I also cut some 8-inch squares out of freezer paper. And I'm going to set them on my ironing board with the shiny waxy side face up. and position one of my background squares over the paper and just kind of hold it in place with one hand and place your iron over it. And what that'll do is fuse the fabric to the paper. And freezer paper is a really great option for a stabilizer because it's readily available and inexpensive. It's not anything specialty that you have to get at the sewing store. And it sticks really nicely to the paper, but in a very unpermanent way. So it's easy to get off when you're finished. So it just gives the fabric a little more stiffness and body, which makes a huge difference if you are going to put these under your sewing machine to sew your appliques down after you fuse them. Okay, so I've got my freezer paper on, and now I have my applique shape, my little orange peel that's going to go on there. So first thing I'm going to do is peel off the back paper, this gridded paper that's on the back, to expose the web underneath. And just like it was on the other side that we stuck to the black fabric, it's kind of tacky at this point, but you can reposition it. So I'm going to just kind of eyeball and estimate this, how to get this centered. If you want to be really precise, you know what we could do is fold our piece on diagonal like this, and then position the points along that fold line on both sides, and that way we know that we have it centered. And then I'm just going to kind of just finger press it down. Okay, so now we have that in place, and I'm going to put my silicone mat over top of it before I put my iron on. This is to protect the surface of my iron, just in case there's any bits of the fusible web that aren't all the way under fabric or leak out from behind it, so that I don't get that on my iron. And I have my iron set hot, which is what the instructions on the fusible web said to do. And I'm just holding it over the parts of my block for a few seconds each, kind of moving it around, giving that heat a chance to fuse. And let's see how it looks. Yeah, that's really nice. So the fusible web on the package says that it is permanent. So at this point you can just sew your pieces together and make your quilt, and you're good to go. I think that I am going to use a blanket stitch on my sewing machine to stitch around each one. And the reason for that is just personal preference. I really like things to have a nice finished edge, but it could also be a place where you can add some more decoration to your quilt. So maybe you want to use a little bit heavier thread, and maybe a color that stands out, so that really shows up and you see that blanket stitching around that outlines the shapes. That could be really cute. You could use a decorative stitch instead of just a plain blanket stitch or zigzag. You could use a decorative stitch if you have that on your machine, or an embroidery stitch to outline those and just add something different. You can also just, like I said, sew them together, and then when you quilt the quilt, that will hold the pieces in place so that they stay on, like if you were to wash the quilt and that sort of thing. So quilting is also a way that you can hold those in place. So I am going to make a few of these blocks, and then I will meet you back at the design wall, and we'll see how they look when we put a few of them together and play with different layouts. Ta-da! Here are the first 4 applique blocks that I made, and I am totally loving the black on the bright colors. I think this is going to be a ton of fun, and I have enough fabric I can keep cutting more squares and do all of my scraps. So I have some white ones mixed in. These were left over from a project I did where the corner shapes of my quilt were alternating black and white. So of course I ended up with scraps of both. So I think that it could be fun to do a variety kind of mixed together and put a bunch of them together just kind of for a fun, scrappy looking quilt. It can be as scrappy as I want it to look, or it can be as planned depending on, you know, how I position the colors for the background squares. But I really like where this is going, and as you can tell, it has a lot of options to make yours exactly how you want it to be. You don't have to set them like regular orange peels. You could potentially like sew these together and then add, you know, fuse these again. You can really go crazy. Oh, you know what? What if we did the white ones? Like if we sew all these together and then add the white ones and make kind of a flower. Like, oh, they're not gonna stick, but you get the idea. You could create kind of a flower shape by adding the white ones on top. Now, of course, you're not going to have the same scraps as I do, but this technique works for any size of shapes that you have and for as many as you want. You can overlap them, you can arrange them the way that you want. The sky's the limit. But I hope that this gives you some good ideas and gets you excited about saving those scraps and making them into another fabulous quilt. If you're interested in curved piecing and want to learn more and become great at it and make all kinds of fun quilts, make sure that you subscribe to the YouTube channel here and check out my other videos, but definitely sign up to receive email from me. There's a link in my bio, or go to colorgirlquilts.com and sign up there. Most of what I do, I send to my email list, so that is the best place to be. Also at Color Girl Quilts, you'll find patterns and fabric and rulers and lots of fun things for quilters to play with. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and be sure and share what you make with me. I always enjoy seeing how you are inspired from the projects I'm creating. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.